The world of miniature painting is filled with tons of questions. What kind of paint should I use? What kind of brushes should I use? How do I make this miniature pop? What's the fastest and easiest way to win a golden demon? How do I blend? What kind of airbrush should I get? Should I even get an airbrush? Is it cheating? I know, it's all a lot of noise, but luckily for you, I've got you covered. That's right, it's time for another episode of the Miniature Painting Fundamentals series. The series designed to answer all of your miniature painting questions. And today, we're tackling color. Now mind you, this is episode 3, so if you haven't seen the 2 previous videos, I highly suggest that you go back and watch those first. There are links to both of these videos pinned down in the top comment. And don't forget that there are extended edits available of each of these over on my Patreon. So if you like what you see, please consider supporting me over on Patreon. Now, before we can handle all of these questions regarding color, we're going to have to establish some very basic vocabulary. I know, it sounds super boring, but I promise you that I'll try to make this as interesting as possible. First up is value, meaning how dark or light a color is, how close it is to black or how close it is to white. You see, different colors have different levels of brightness, different values. Let's have a look at the color wheel in black and white. Here we can see that violet is the darkest color, whereas yellow is the brightest. And this piece of knowledge is really useful when it comes to selecting our paints when we're painting. Because looking at the color wheel in black and white simply tells us which colors can be used to highlight and which colors can be used to shade the different colors. So when we understand what the color wheel is telling us about value alone, shading and highlighting becomes really simple. Red, for instance, can be shaded using magenta, violet, blue, or even black. And we can highlight it using either orange, yellow, or a bright green, or of course, white. In this way, we're following the principles of value laid out in the color wheel. If we turn on our color vision again, we'll see all of the chroma or all of the hues shown in the color wheel. Chroma and hue are just fancy words of describing color. The term saturation is used to describe how strong a color is, how close it is to gray, or how far away it is from gray. When we're looking at the color wheel, just like here, we're seeing colors in some of their most saturated forms. As we near the center of the color wheel, we go closer towards gray. Contrast is a term that refers to the difference between two different things. And it's oftentimes used to describe how many darker values we have versus how many lighter values we have. So if we have very dark shadows and if we have very bright highlights, then we have high contrast. And miniature painters love high contrast. This higher contrast helps to create scale and believability to the paint job. But contrast can also describe the relationship between different colors, not only in terms of value. There's a big difference in terms of value as well as in terms of hue between the colors blue and yellow. And therefore, using blue in a mostly yellow setting will help to create a lot of visual interest and really stick out. And a really common way to describe this difference between yellow and blue is to describe them in terms of temperature. We can simply divide the color wheel in 2 different sides, a warm side and a cold side. And on the border area between the two, we'll have magenta red and green yellow. So another difference between blue and yellow is that blue is generally considered a cold color, whereas yellow is generally considered a warm color. Colors placed directly across from each other are called complementaries. This means that they have the strongest amount of contrast between them in terms of color. But as we saw in the black and white example earlier, violet and yellow also has the biggest difference in terms of value, whereas colors like green and red are much more similar in terms of value. Colors closer to each other on the color wheel are generally perceived to have much less contrast to one another. Here we have the primaries. These are colors that, generally speaking, can't be mixed. We have yellow, red, and blue. Mixing each of these primaries together, we'll get what's called secondaries. These are the colors that sit in between the primaries. This means that mixing yellow and red will give us orange. Mixing red and blue will give us violet. Mixing blue and yellow will give us green. Furthermore, we can mix each of these secondaries with their primaries on each side to get tertiary colors. These are colors that sit between the secondaries and primaries. Here we'll have warm yellow, reddish orange, magenta, purplish blue, turquoise, and cold green. Also notice how the lower portion of the wheel is very desaturated. The magenta-violet spectrum is hard to mix with the primaries using red, blue, and yellow. This is why some people like to use magenta and cyan instead of blue and red with their primaries. And this is totally fine, but the reality is that there are many great red pigments available, whereas magenta is much harder to come by in properties that are attractive for miniature painters. And historically, red, blue and yellow have been the go-to for many great painters. So hopefully you can see that mixing the colors following the rules of the color wheel allows for some very versatile painting with very few paints needed. But it's nice to have more paints when you're looking for something that's even more saturated than what you can get with mixing the primaries alone, like these colors here. In the middle of the color wheel, there's no color. It's black, white and gray. Now you can mix complementaries to get this neutral gray color. Here I'm mixing orange and blue to create a neutral-ish gray. This is also what's called a chromatic gray. Okay, so those are the basics covered. You now know the terms value, meaning how bright or dark a color is, as well as saturation, meaning how close it is to gray or how pure it is. And lastly, we've discussed a few terms on how to describe the differences between different colors, like contrast, meaning difference, temperature, meaning hot or colder colors, and lastly, complementary relationships, meaning colors that are directly opposed from each other on the color wheel. And these are the basics of color theory. Knowing these won't necessarily make you a better painter, but they will help to inform some of your choices that you're making while you're painting. The best way I can describe color theory is that it's a set of normative statements that describe how colors should behave. And I say should behave because in my experience, it's not always so easy to predict how different colors affect one another. Now, let me give you an example. Take a look at this optical illusion and tell me which color you think is darker. Well, they are the same color. And that's because your brain is looking at the context in order to gauge the different values. Your brain is looking for context in order to understand what it's seeing. And this is really what makes advanced color theory so much harder to pin down, because we're talking about relationships between things that aren't exactly stable. It's like there's too many variables and too many things moving around to exactly describe things in an accurate way. A color might look warm in one context and look cold in another. And same thing goes for saturation, and the same thing goes for value, just as we've seen. This phenomenon is called color constancy and value constancy. And trust me, it's not some magical weird thing. It's very, very real and affects how we paint every day. And it is especially prevalent in more desaturated settings. So, color theory gives us a language to describe how we feel about what we're seeing, but it's not necessarily a description of how to make cool paint jobs. So instead, let's try to talk at some common settings and look at how we can utilize the knowledge of color theory to actually inform our choices while we're painting. How do we select the right paints? How do we create the right mixes in order to convey what we're looking to convey? And let's be mindful that the colors you choose when you're mixing your paints and painting your miniatures can be a result of either wanting to emulate reality, artistic preference, or both. You might want to use a certain color just because you like it and not necessarily because it follows the rules of what fits in the color wheel. And that's totally fine. But I also think that some of this artistic freedom can cause a little bit of confusion when trying to explain these things in a consistent manner. So let's start by having a look at some very simple lighting scenarios that we might want to imagine while painting our miniatures. If we're outside in the daylight, we tend to see quite a bright ambient light coming from the sky and a strong directional light coming from the sun. So we can use something like ice yellow to show that warm temperature of the sunlight, and use something slightly colder and a little bit more blue to show the ambient light from the sky. Now, in places where the sunlight is going to hit directly, it's going to overpower that softer blue light coming from the sky. And so that's not going to be visible. So where we're really going to see more of these bluish tones is going to be in the shadows. These shadows are not completely black. In fact, they're not nearly as dark as one might think. But in a sunlight scenario, it's simply the absence of sunlight that creates the shadows. And so because the light bounces around everywhere, we're going to get what's called ambient light inside of the shadows. And so here's how we can translate this knowledge onto the painting of our miniatures. If we know the local color of the materials that we have on our miniature, we can simply mix in a little bit of blue into the shadows and a little bit of yellow into the highlights. So the shadows are going to be pulled towards the same area and the highlights are going to be pulled towards the same area. So really it's in the spectrum of the midtones that we tell what color of material we're looking at. Of course, there can be differences in the relationship between these darker shadows and these brighter lights and how much space the midtones take up in different materials. This deals with the finish of each individual object. A white t-shirt is never going to have as dark shadows as black hair, for instance. But I find that using the same colors for the shadows and using the same colors for the highlights really helps to tie together the miniature artistically and gives us that feeling of ambience. By choosing these colors, we're communicating that we have the warm sunlight from the sun and the blue ambience coming from the sky. Make sense? Good. Let's move on to a different scenario. Let's talk about nightlight. If we're painting a nighttime scene, everything is going to be more of a grayish blue. This is because the moon has a much softer and a little bit of a colder light than the sun. I know, shocking, right? It's dark at night. But this really poses an interesting challenge because of how dark everything is going to be. This means that the highlights won't go nearly as bright and the shadows will go way darker. And this makes nighttime settings such a good candidate for OSL effects. The shadows at nighttime are really so dark that it can be hard to tell their temperature or their color. But here you can take some creative license and play around with some violets, magentas, purples, blackish reds, whatever you like. Just make sure to keep the miniature overall much darker than the daylight scenario we talked about just previously. For more of an urban setting, you might want to consider playing around with different colored lights. So neon signs, for instance, that can have quite a drastic effect on the reading of local colors. And here it's a really good idea to look for references. In fact, it's always a good idea to look for references before painting. Neon light, for instance, overpowers the local color of the object quite heavily. Notice how both the skin and the white t-shirt are quite heavily affected by the neon light cast in this picture. Now, for all of these scenarios, I highly recommend that you look up some references. This will help to add some realism and some readability to your paint job. But it's your miniature and you can use whatever you want. As long as you obey the rules of value, you should be good with color. So now we've looked at different examples of color and light and how to use this when selecting our paints. My recommendation for you, if you're just starting out here, or if you're simply looking to challenge yourself, is to limit yourself to a very limited palette. And then try to mix the colors that you need from these. And especially if you have some pre-mixed paints that you really like, try to recreate some of these mixes using only the primaries. This will embed the knowledge of color theory into your practice much more than any one video can. So that's the exercise for today's lesson. Paint a miniature using only the primaries plus black and white, and try to have a painting session where you just sit down to mix some of your favorite pre-mixed paints. You can color match these using just the primaries and black and white. This will help you practice the principles of color theory a lot, and I promise you it'll teach you something about how colors work. And if you're curious about how such a miniature looks, you can go ahead and check out my librarian painting. And here I painted this entire model using just this limited palette. And I think that it turned out quite well. Would you agree? Thank you so much for watching. If you like what you've seen and would like to see some more, be sure to check out the Patreon. You can also consider giving this video a like. It's totally free for you to do, and it gives me a better idea of what kind of content I should create in the future.